it is common to feel some culture shock when researching ancient societies. You'll find something that will make you halt in your tracks, even after years of investigation into a society. The influence of the ancient Romans on the modern world is unparalleled, and remnants of their laws, culture, and religion may still be seen in contemporary civilization. However, this does not imply that everything the Romans did was rational. Here are some startlingly bizarre facts about the Romans in antiquity. Number 1. They considered Christianity to be a cannibalistic blood cult. Roman invasions were undoubtedly unpleasant, but as conquerors, they weren't all that horrible. For example, they normally didn't interfere with the religious practices of native people. The Romans were most likely prone to incorporating other people's religions into their own. This explains why the pantheons of the Roman and Greek cultures are so similar. So, what was the Romans' problem with Jews and early Christians for so long? The Romans just found Jewish and Christian customs repulsive, which is part of the reason, but not the entire cause. The Jewish tradition of circumcision was frowned upon by the Romans, who saw it as a terrible kind of genital mutilation. The Romans committed numerous atrocities in the name of their gods, but apparently, that small amount of flesh at the apex of the penis was too much for them. Christians, on the other hand, were initially perceived to be cannibalistic blood cults. The Romans misunderstood the concept and took the flesh of Christ and blood of Christ, portions of Holy Communion, far too literally. Number 2. Fathers might sell their sons as slaves. It is well known that the Romans heavily employed slaves. Their dominion was constructed on the backs of the enemies they had vanquished. Roman slaves had no rights and endured awful conditions. Unless they disobeyed the law, Roman people were typically shielded from the dangers of slavery. However, there was one odd exception. Roman fathers had the option of temporarily selling or renting out their sons as slaves. The price and length of the son's servitude would be agreed upon by the father and the potential buyer. The buyer was required to deliver the son back at the end of the time period in a state that was similar to the one he had got him in. The father could only do this in moderation, as was the case with most things in Roman society. Everything was alright, as long as he didn't sell the same son again. But if he sold the son a third time, he was deemed unsuitable to be a father. Any son who had been sold 3 times by his father was legally freed from his materialistic parents, but only after he had served his third term as a slave. However, each child was subject to the law of 3 sales. That implied that a father only needed to produce more children if he wanted to continue profiting from them. Number 3. They had perplexing rules concerning adultery. It should come as no surprise that the Romans had different laws, depending on whether the wife or the husband was discovered cheating. Unsurprisingly, men were essentially allowed to live their lives as they pleased. Nobody would object if husband had mistresses or slept with prostitutes. It only became a problem if it was determined that the husband was overindulging. But it was an entirely different story for the wife. A husband was required to lock his wife and the other man in the room when he discovered them having a passionate encounter. He then had 20 hours to gather as many witnesses as he could. He had a further 3 days to collect his evidence after he had his witnesses. He needed to know the length of the affair, the location, the identity of the lover, and any other relevant information he could gather. The husband had to divorce his wife after gathering all the necessary information. Because the Romans didn't believe in forgiving, if the husband didn't get a divorce, he may be accused of pimping out his wife. As long as the man was a slave or a prostitute, the husband might kill his wife's lover if he genuinely desired to exact retribution. Things got more complicated if the partner was a citizen. The spouse then had to involve his father-in-law. In ancient Rome, fathers had the authority to execute their daughters' lovers. No matter the lover's social standing, he was dead if the father so desired. Additionally, there was a potential that the father would decide to murder his daughter while he was at it, sparing the spouse the hassle of a divorce. Number 4. Purple clothing was prohibited. At this time, it's quite widely accepted that the Romans were fascinated with class, just like many other societies. But many people are unaware of the Romans' obsessional nature though. Consider the fact that most free Romans were forbidden from donning the color purple. Purple color was a symbol of splendor, majesty, and monarchy in Roman culture. As a result, only very high-ranking Romans, including the emperor, were permitted to wear a purple toga. Purple color acquired this reputation because making purple dye was astronomically expensive. Phoenicia was the source of all purple dye. 10,000 mollusks had to be crushed in order to produce enough dye for one toga. In other words, purple dye had a value similar to that of gold, pound for pound. Number 5. Fathers used to be able to murder their families legally. Although patriarchy existed in ancient Rome from the beginning, the Romans were particularly extreme. In the early days, the members of a man's family in ancient Rome were essentially his belongings. The fact that he could do whatever he wanted with them explains how he was able to sell his sons as slaves. How a father disciplined his children was entirely up to him. He could murder his children without fear of legal ramifications if he believed they deserved to perish. His children were not necessarily safe, even after leaving the house. A daughter could still be murdered by her father after getting married off and leaving the nest. Additionally, sons were never secure. Only after being sold 3 times or following the passing of their father, they finally attained true independence. These limitations were ultimately loosened. Most of the time, the right of a man to murder his family had been overturned by the 1st century BC. However, if a son committed a crime and damaged the family's reputation, his father was still permitted to kill him. Number 6. Blonde hair dye was required for prostitutes. This norm, once more, is heavily influenced by the Roman preoccupation with social class and rank. Dark-haired women made up the vast majority of native-born Roman women. Barbarians and Gauls were both thought to have blonde hair. There were no social penalties for men who engaged in prostitution in ancient Roman society because it was entirely legal. However, the prostitutes themselves, particularly the lower class ones, tended to be despised. A legislation was introduced that mandated prostitutes, many of whom were slaves, and as such had no choice, had to dye their hair blonde, in order to prevent nice and honest Roman women from being mistaken for prostitutes. The idea was that by doing this, they would resemble the barbarian Gauls rather than the regal Roman females. Initially, this law was effective. But, to the lawmakers' regret, noble Roman ladies soon began to covet the seductive, blonde appearance. They started either dyeing their own hair, or they had the unfortunate prostitutes shave their heads, so that blonde wigs could be created. Number 7. Body parts from a gladiator used for medicine. Surprisingly, this Roman aversion did not extend to gladiator body parts. Consuming gladiator body parts was thought to help treat a variety of diseases by Roman medics. Their blood and livers were apparently very effective at treating epilepsy. When gladiator games were outlawed after 400 AD, the Romans substituted the blood of condemned criminals. If that wasn't revolting enough, the Roman preoccupation with eating gladiator parts also permeated the culture's aesthetic practices and intimate settings. Gladiators' dead skin cells, which were removed from their baths, were utilized as aphrodisiacs and in face creams. Number 8. The ultimate punishment in Rome. The worst thing you could have done was to be slain by your father. The Romans used a variety of creative methods to murder prisoners and criminals. They might be subjected to gladiatorial contests and displaced, beheaded, or thrown from great heights. For individuals who committed patricide, the worst form of execution was reserved. Anyone found guilty of committing a patricide was initially blindfolded because they were no longer deemed deserving of being in the light. After that, they were led by the hand out of town and into the closest body of water. They were tortured with rods till they were hardly alive. They were then tied and put with a snake, dog, ape, and rooster into a big leather sack. The entire group was then dumped into the water, where they either perished from drowning or were mauled to death by the writhing beasts. Number 9. The value of urine as a commodity. Public restrooms had extensive use during the Roman era. They served as significant social hubs, in addition to being restrooms. Of course, there was a lot of garbage created by these bustling public restrooms, so the Romans had to come up with some fairly creative ways to get rid of it. Engineering prowess was a Roman strength. The Cloaca Maxima, one of the earliest sewage systems in history, received the majority of the sewage produced by Rome's populace. Because of its ammonia content, the pee from this location was collected and sold as a chemical for use in tanning leather and in laundry. In areas outside of Rome, fulans or Roman dry cleaners would go to the restrooms and collect the pee themselves. Urine became so profitable that Emperor Vespasian taxed it. When his son, Titus, grumbled about his father's nasty method of currency production, Vespasian urged him to smell a gold coin. He then inquired whether it stank, and when his son said no, the emperor said, "Yet it originates from urine." Number 10. Disturbing Roman public toilets. The Romans were often considered to be a clean people, and this was mostly accurate. However, this does not imply that modern standards would be met by Roman public restrooms. Rome had more than 140 communal restrooms. These weren't private areas, but rather locations where individuals might interact while attending to their daily affairs. As was already established, the majority of these public restrooms were interconnected by remarkable sewage networks that would take later societies generations to match. The good news ends there. Archaeologists have discovered a wealth of evidence that these public restrooms were biohazards, just waiting to happen. There is evidence to imply that these restrooms were almost never cleaned. According to archaeological evidence, they were covered in parasites including cockroaches, fleas, lice, and roundworms. As if that wasn't awful enough, these toilets predated toilet paper by millennia. Each public toilet had only one tessorium, which was a single sponge on a stick. After defecating, this was used to wipe, and this was also never cleaned. Even worse, rats and snakes lived in the sewage system. There are instances where people who overstayed their welcome while using the restroom were bitten. Large volumes of methane were also created by the restrooms. Under the toilets, this had a dreadful habit of piling up, till it ultimately lit and became breathtakingly explosive. The situation was so bad that public restroom walls have been found with demon-repelling spells engraved into them. When they needed the restroom, some people even carried statues of Fortuna, the Roman goddess of luck. For centuries, historians romanticized the Roman period, and its flaws were often ignored. Civil rights, unless you were born into the right family, were almost non-existent, and slaves lived a hellish existence. But we must always try to learn from history, without judging too harshly.